Hey, it's Neil Whitman here, and this is kind of my first foray into the conversation that's surrounding what I think is rightly being called the meaning crisis. And if you're here, it's probably because you know exactly what I'm talking about and you're curious about this. But if not, I think what is being discussed, and there's a lot of guys entering into this field. Certainly, one could say this is something that really started with Peterson as a conversation about why men and women are unfulfilled with what is being offered by the contemporary environment, the contemporary political commentary, and certainly what's being taught as the ideological imperatives of our age in modernity. What comes out of atheistic materialism ultimately, and how this fails to fulfill some deep need inside of people. Now, I realize there's a lot of guys talking productively in this field, and that there are people who have been at this for a good time, and you might wonder why so late in the game is this guy trying to communicate into this field, and I suppose that's a fair question. It's something that I've been following from the sidelines for a number of years, and it's something that I have certainly engaged in personally and person to person quite a bit. Uh, but perhaps I'll start by saying, well, hey, I just recently had a career change, so my field of interest is growing and expanding, as are the types of conversations that I'm able to have freely on the internet. So I did recently retire from 20 years of service in the Canadian Armed Forces. I've been an infantry officer there for 20 years, and done quite a few things in that environment, including peacekeeping tour to Haiti in 2004, and combat tour in Afghanistan in 2007. And that, I will say, uh, it was a real combat tour, and I am not in any way trying to diminish anyone's contribution to these kinds of things. Simply trying to communicate to those that might question it that no, I definitely was in conflict directly, and engaged in that rather difficult field of actually killing people, and having them try to kill me directly, which, that has its effects and its challenges, which I only really say to kind of highlight that there's an extreme experience there that informs one's understanding of a lot of things that you are exposed to that really don't fit into the narrative that's being taught to you back here when you come back to the safe place that you came from before you went. And, in that regard, I would say, for those who might drop in on this commentary that also have served, I'm certainly no war hero, nor am I some kind of conqueror, or do I declare myself to be somehow, a tremendous fighter. But I guess what I would say to that is that I experienced quite enough of that to have a really full appreciation of what it is, and what it does to you. Not nearly as much as many of my peers and former subordinates, but I would say quite a lot more than most have had to experience. Quite a lot more. So, what's my point? My point would be that as I look into this conversation, there is something that does seem to be missing in the conversation. as Peterson brought it out, and I want to say that he has my mad respect. Like, Jordan Peterson did not seek this whole thing out. It came upon him. He made an ethical decision where he refused to acknowledge the right of government to curtail his freedom of speech, even while he really had no issue whatsoever with acknowledging somebody's desired means of being addressed. He still thought this is wrong. My government should not dictate how I communicate to somebody. It's going into a very perilous environment. Because of that, he became obviously the media sensation that he was. And for a guy that was watching this whole thing unfold on the sidelines and very much involved in it in the environment where I was, because that same imposition certainly was coming down in our world. I I respect that he held his position and he demonstrated his integrity and consistency in what he believed was demonstrated in his action. And then he had this platform that he decided to use to communicate what he thought was um, of worth to those who were looking to hear something. And I appreciate the sincerity and the intensity with which he engaged in that, and the tremendous care he demonstrated in trying not to bring harm, but to sincerely seek out what people needed and what they were missing and try to give that to them. And obviously, that became the impetus for those biblical series lectures that he did, where he brought forward the symbolism of Genesis and tried to encourage people to look at the Bible in a different way, and and that has had a pretty significant. It has had a pretty significant impact for the last 4 years, anyway. And we'll have to wait and see if this torch continues to burn and people continue to be drawn to it. I certainly do hope, and I pray for Peterson's return to the conversation, and perhaps even with more vigor and less restraint. Uh, if well, maybe should qualify that less reluctance to engage in some of the higher things that he may have communicated in his private lectures when he's communicating publicly. So here is my contention, that even while this conversation is happening, and I really, like I said, I respect what Peterson has done, and I respect the conversations that are going on around that with guys like Jonathan Pageau, who's, as the Greek Orthodox guy that is speaking to the symbolism of the scripture and trying to communicate how we can grab a hold of that in accordance with his understanding of his tradition or his adopted tradition. And you've got guys like the Vervecki guy who is trying to reach into this philosophically and understand what it is that this God-shaped hole is that we need, and that we seem to need to have some answer to. And as I said, Paul Vanderklay, who I just recently talked to, who is speaking into this from the position of a pastor and who wants to communicate on that level with those who are asking questions, and to try and communicate what the Christian church really might have to offer to those people who are maybe looking again for the first time, or looking for the first time. And even my my associates over there at Uberboyo, if they'll tolerate me calling them that, who I really enjoy their attempt to kind of draw into this conversation and to look into Carl Jung and what he taught, and to psychologically analyze this whole thing. This is a lot of work's being done, and that's definitely something that has to be acknowledged and respected. But what isn't happening, uh, by and large, and there are exceptions even on that list to what I'm saying, but what isn't happening when Peterson talks, and it isn't happening when uh, when most of these folks talk, is we talk about the need for this higher thing. The guys, it's often referred to as something like the collective unconscious, or the something, the other, the power, the thing that the symbols are, which is true, the meme sphere, I think, as Steph once put it, and or something, words to that effect. Anyway, this real thing that is other, that we're trying to engage with, and that is spiritual, uh, or something like that, right? Uh, and then they take that and in the main try and say, now how can I grab a hold of it and use that thing to make me better, to overcome this struggle or this issue, to grow in my own understanding and strength. And well, yeah, I mean, you can do that, and it really has a genuine effect. You can look at the symbolism of Scripture, and you can say, well, this book, if I reach over here, and oh, there it is. There's my old Bible that's been all around the world with me, and beat up and covered in gorilla tape, and hooah! Well, I can read this, and I can say, there are a lot of things in here that are kind of neat, and they speak psychological truth, and you might even call this rightly the most accurate psychological text on humanity that's ever been written. And I think you'd be right to do that, because the Bible, through its symbols and its stories, has more accurately depicted the way that you act than any psychologist probably ever has. And if Carl Jung comes close, it's because he was actually looking at the Bible as his primary source text for understanding people, and it does a pretty good job of reflecting the way that you think, the way that you act, and the way that you respond to stimulus, the way that you both at the same time want to be this thing, this thing up here. Uh, you want to be that, but you don't want to do the things that get you there, and also you really also want to be down here, and you're in constant conflict over these things, and that's not just a social construct, right? And you can tell yourself that it is, but it's a lot deeper than that, and that's good. Like, as I listen to some of the stuff that the Uberboyo crew have put out, where they analyze the way that we behave, and they look at things like first principles and these kinds of ways of understanding why you think the things that you do, and the way that your instincts are driving you to act in a certain way, and understanding and harnessing that, it can be done, and you can use that productively to push yourself forward in this world. But I do not hear a lot of conversation around the reality of this God. That this thing that you pursue, that can give you truths that will equip you for uh, strength in this life, there's not much being said about what he wants, and how do I engage with him. So that's a thing. There are definitely guys doing this. Ravi Zacharias, of course, does it, and PVK, like I mentioned, certainly is doing his part to communicate with you all on these subjects, and I have mad respect for that. And in many ways, they're doing this in a way that's very superior to me. But here's my thing. So if you've listened this long, then maybe you're curious what I have to say. It goes something like this. Um, I am a guy who has faced all of the darkness of humanity in a pretty tangible way, and I I don't mean to speak arrogantly when I say that, because I absolutely recognize that many people listening to this will have probably experienced many harder things than I have, but I have seen about as bad as people will get. When I was in Haiti, saw the absolute and utter callous disregard for human life, where human life meant nothing whatsoever to a lot of the people there, and they demonstrated that in real ways that are pretty stark and shocking to somebody who was raised in a Western world that taught them that people are basically good. And I also have been in the environment where people have tried to kill me in a place that is not probably as dark as people will ever be, but Afghanistan is a place with a pretty good track record for doing evil things, and you may reject my definition of evil, but I don't know. I'm gonna go out on a limb and say, like, pouring acid over a woman for not having her face uncovered, which, by the way, was other women that did that. In the case I'm thinking of, and being lit on fire, gasoline poured over you if you don't properly cover yourself as a lady, and just generally, going in and hanging a bunch of kids in a village because they talked to the Canadians. That's pretty freaking rotten stuff. And I've experienced that, and I've been in some pretty dark places myself, And when Peterson says you can be the Auschwitz guard, and that's what you have to recognize, is you have that in you to do that. I know, I've seen my darkness. I have definitely engaged with those primal instincts, and we could have some dialogue about that stuff. But I've been there, and I've also been in some of the most complex moral environments that I think exists. So, having spent a year in diplomatic work in Israel, between Palestine and Israel, um, you want to talk about a problem that doesn't appear to have any really clear right, because everybody has really legitimate reasons to be upset, and everybody is also acting pretty badly towards everybody else on all sides, and and it's pretty gray stuff, and I've seen that. So that being said, and all of that being true, I still have confidence in my God, and I have great strength in my faith, and He is in a very real way. He has helped me and guided me through the darkness that comes from dealing with a lot of that stuff. So I guess that's why I think maybe I have something to say. Um, just a comment on that. So, like I said, I don't consider myself brilliant. I don't carry a PhD in psychology, not a psychologist. Um, it's not what I did. I'm an infantry officer. I trained people to kill people. That was kind of my life, was to equip people for violence for the sake of government policy and furthering that through violence. That's what we do, right? And and that doesn't maybe at first cut seem like the kind of thing that equips you for a philosophical conversation on the meaning crisis or the reason to exist. But there's a thing that I have for quite a few years told my junior officers and my senior NCOs when teaching them and trying to get some ideas across about how to lead well. And that thing is understanding what humility really is, right? Humility and the idea of modesty, that humility simply means not putting yourself forward. I'm sure that could be understood as a definition of humility, but it's a pretty useless way to be. And really, the right way to understand and apply humility, as I would tell these guys, is to know that true humility is not recognizing your bad points. True humility is knowing your strengths and your weaknesses honestly, both. And then being unashamed to rely on your strength and unashamed to acknowledge your weakness and use whatever means you have to overcome those weaknesses. Which generally in that context is meaning find somebody who's good at the things you aren't and let them know that you're not great at that, so they're going to need to pick up the slack and tell you when you're off base, right? That's a pretty humbling thing to do. But if you only do that and you don't acknowledge the things that you actually do have to bring to the table, then you're pretty useless, right? So here's me acknowledging there's a lot of things I don't got in this conversation, but there's some things I do have too. There's some observational skills that I have developed over the years by God's grace and Her Majesty's coin, I suppose, uh, and forbearance, certainly in many aspects of my career. Uh, but I dare say that I have, well, it's been my job. The government has paid me to be an observer of human behavior and to make good counseling decisions in regards to that, to equip people to overcome their shortcomings and to improve themselves in at least the field that we're there to train them in. And that's what I have to bring is those skills, uh, accompanied with a great deal of experience with some of the most uh, hard aspects of human behavior, and and the fact that I'm here talking to you as a sane person, well, that's pretty debatable, I suppose, but as a person who is not broken by guilt or overwhelmed by the damage of the trauma that I've experienced, is actually statistically, I am the anomaly. There are there are not many of us who have done the things that I have done. There are not many of the guys that I did that with who have not succumbed to pretty significant hurt. that has deeply impaired their experience of the world. And that's not a criticism of them. It's certainly not an exaltation of me. It is a statement that perhaps the thing that I have, maybe it's worth talking about that thing if what it does is it gives you a mechanism to really overcome the hurt that is in the world. So that's what I want to talk about. I have a different experience and I have a different perspective than maybe has been put forward before. And this will be a fairly short video, but here's my culminating point. So for the last number of years, I've been, before I retired, and I just retired in July, and have since gone into this work where my job is to guide people towards truth, and it's a delight to be able to kind of commit myself to that. But that's always been my aspiration, in as much as I am able to do anything of value in it. So the last few years, as I was working my way through seminary and preparing to do this, the Army had me in a position as a training officer, running a training company. And so I would often, with pretty much each course, have an ethics seminar that I had to teach and sort of lead them in that. And so this is one little tidbit from that might pique your interest and maybe challenge some of your thinking. So here it is. It's the idea of integrity. So within the Canadian Armed Forces, we have this system of ethics and value. I should say they have it, because I'm not there anymore. Although technically I'm Major Neil Whitman retired, but that's only technical. I'm just Mr. Whitman. So they have this system of ethics and values, and it's basically got 3 points, and I won't go into them right now. Pretty wise points that basically speak to some broad principles that are good guidelines for behavior. And then they talk about some values that are, again, very, very principle oriented to help you know what sort of character you ought to have if you're going to be, as I often said, trusted to decide whether or not to shoot somebody. It's probably a good idea to tell whether or not you have the right character if that's what you're going to do. So we talk about this, and pretty much every individual training course that I would run, I'd have them in there, and we'd talk through the ethics thing. I always get to integrity, and integrity is one of those interesting words, right? So we like to talk about integrity, and I'm pretty sure that's a universal thing, that integrity is a word that is cherished in most lines of work, most anyway, or at least we believe we cherish it. So the thing about integrity is, when you ask people, what does that mean? Like you'd ask a class of guys to define the word integrity. And typically, I would say nearly always, the answer is doing the right thing when nobody's looking. And that's fine. I've actually, one time a guy said what I thought was a much better answer was doing the right thing when other people don't want you to. Because that's a pretty insightful comment, that doing the right thing when nobody's looking is actually a lot easier than doing the right thing when everybody's looking and hates you for it. But neither of them are actually correct, because integrity isn't that. That is the symptom of integrity. So what is integrity? If you think about it in terms of a structure, it's pretty obvious what we mean when we say structural integrity. It means that the building is built in such a way that it continues to stand up and it doesn't fall down. So what structural integrity really is that all of the beams, the foundation first, and then the beams that are built on that, and all of the bracings and the bolts and the nails and the screws that are being used in the construction, they're working together to resist the efforts of outside forces like wind and snow on the roof to cause that building to fall over or to fall down because of the weight on the top, right? And that's structural integrity. Good structural integrity means everything is working together to resist that. And if you're in an earthquake zone, well, what might have good structural integrity here in New Brunswick, Canada, well, that might not there because you're dealing with different forces and you need a different kind of foundation that's going to not crack and collapse underneath that potential rocking motion. And so you've got those skyscrapers that are built that way to endure that with the shocks and all that great stuff. So it's the way that you achieve it may be complicated, but the idea is actually quite simple. It's simply that everything works together and it resists outside forces, causing it to leave what it was intended to do. Now you take that back, and it's exactly the same thing when you draw that picture for your moral or ethical integrity. Integrity is not doing the right thing when nobody's looking, because that idea doesn't actually make any sense unless you know what the right thing is. You get my point, is that integrity is when you have a secure set of beliefs which then demonstrates itself consistently in your thoughts and actions in such a way that it resists outside forces' attempts to shift those behaviors. So your foundation, which is your core belief system or your core values, is strong enough and rooted enough in your behaviors through discipline and repetitive behavior and endurance and the application of exercise, moral exercise, which is in many ways not different from physical, that as you go through increasingly hard challenges, you grow and grow and grow, and your security and the actions that you do more and more are rooted in those core set of beliefs that you have. And that's important. So somebody who does the right thing, who doesn't believe that's the right thing, fundamentally, is not acting with integrity. They're actually speaking or acting in a way that is contrary to their own value system. So someone who is a narcissist that thinks they are the most important thing going, that then acts in a selfless way because that is what is expected of them, is violating their own principles. They are not demonstrating integrity, and they have created a cognitive dissonance between their behaviors that are expected of them and their own personal values. And that cognitive dissonance means that it works when you are in control, but it fails the minute that instinct takes over. And so it's really easy to do those things, but only when you do them in an environment where you are rewarded for that behavior and it is in your best interest, and that you have not lost control of your mental faculties, because it is an intellectual, reasoned response rather than an instinctive, what I would call a spiritual response. And then you take somebody like that and you put them in an environment where you put them under sleep deprivation. It's one of the things we do in the Army. Then you see their behavior changes because they start acting in the way that they believe that their value system demands, because they're not acting consciously. They are not controlling their behavior, and so they're responding to stimuli before they are able to reason it through what's the thing that's best for them in the situation, and then they fail. So it's anyone who's ever trained soldiers knows exactly what I'm talking about. Uh, and that's the same thing that happens in any stressful environment when your value system is contrary to the expected behavior. So integrity really matters because what needs to happen for you to act in a way that is actually consistent with the things that you think you should do requires you to actually think about what you believe. And not a lot of people do that thing. They don't really self-examine to the point where they're able to know what it is that they truly value. They are simply stuck in the place of instinctive response and doing what's expected of them to get ahead, right? And then they dumb their minds out and don't try and be introspective at all. In the quiet moments, they pull their phone out or turn the TV on and shut their brain off. And then the tragedy happens, or the traumatic incident, and they are not equipped to even understand why they are responding in the way that they are, because they don't actually know what they value. And they've never tested that, and they've never explored that. And here's the kicker, and here's the thing that I bring to contest. Not all value systems are equal. Our world wants to say tolerate all worldviews, they are all of equal merit, and that's simply not true. It isn't, and anyone who wants to say that should definitely turn this video off and walk away, because you're not going to appreciate my perspective on this. Having been to Haiti, I will tell you one thing that I will never take back. Voodoo culture is inferior in every single way to the culture that I grew up with. It is vile, and it is filled with a disrespect for human life, and it is something that celebrates debauchery and wickedness that is destructive to all of its participants. And you can disagree with me on that, but you're wrong. You can look at the Aztecs and say, oh, well, that Cortez fellow, he was an awful mean guy and he did terrible things, and it shows Christianity's terrible, which, by the way, just shows that you are also subjective when you're evaluating culture and value systems. You just only pick on the one that you don't like. They recently unearthed, and you can look this up, one of the towers of skulls that was at Tenochtitlan, where Cortez had gone in after the initial conflict there and killed everybody and paved it over. I mean, you probably would too if you'd seen what was actually happening there. You don't get it. Like, this culture thought that the right thing to do was to capture, enslave people, and then cut their still beating hearts out and offer them to their god, and then sow their fields with the blood of these people. And I am not exaggerating this. Like, there's thousands of skulls of slain victims that were put on spikes outside of the temple, to pierce through here and here, in succession on these spikes. And there is an enormous amount of corroborating evidence that this is not in any way an exaggeration. This is what these people did. And they thought it right to enslave and murder everyone that was around them. Right? Children, women, men, all in good health. And you want to tell me that that is equivalent to Christian culture? You are incorrect. So here's the thing. You need to do an objective evaluation of the value system you have. And you need to look at these things, because Peterson is right that the Christian value system is the best one for you to get ahead, but it's also the only one that really properly addresses your brokenness and your Auschwitz guard inside of you. and tells you how to fix that thing. So if you want to explore that with me, then I encourage you to ask me questions and to stick along for the ride as I try and engage in this conversation and give you, uh, I think, real biblical answers, which, not maybe a lot of people really challenge themselves to do in this forum. So I'm ready to give it the college try if you want to fire that at me. Peace and good night.